Stories, music, life. It's Late Night Graham Torrington. Shortly before she died, Will's mum gave him her diaries. She wrote in incredible detail about her life during the war, including some very candid descriptions about what she got up to whilst Will's dad was away. They are such a remarkable snapshot of a time that's gone by that Will has now turned them into a book, and he joins me in the studio this evening. Will, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to actually come into the studio tonight.
That's okay, Graham, thanks. Yeah.
So why do you think your mum gave you these diaries then?
Well, I think that they meant a great deal to her. I didn't know of their existence before she gave them to me, and she was 83 when she gave them to me, so it was a long time of keeping them, as it were, under wraps. These diaries, because they're war year diaries, they stand out as being something different. I did find, once I got into them, which didn't happen straight away, I found them absolutely fascinating to read.
Well, let's go back then. Tell me about your mum and your dad.
Well, they were childhood lovers, in fact. They met at the latest when my dad was 17, because I know that I think they fell in love on his 17th birthday. He was a really keen motorcyclist, a cyclist first, going up into Derbyshire on the cycle with my mother on the tandem. And then later on, he was a very, very keen motorcyclist. They got together, obviously, more closely by 1939, because it was in December 39 that they got married. Mm. And that was 3 months after my father had volunteered to go into the army.
Well, Mum is from Chilwell and
yes.
Father's from Beeston. Well, before you talk about your Mum and what she wrote, let's ask about your father. I gather he would never talk about his wartime experiences.
No, he was a very quiet man, and at first glance, quite a mild-mannered man as well. He liked to smoke his pipe, he liked to sit in a corner and watch the television and keep himself to himself. But actually, he did have quite a temper when he got riled. And I felt the back end of his belt on more than one occasion when I was late home. Nevertheless, he was, most of the time, he was a mild-mannered guy, but my mother was like shall we say, a prima donna, it has to be said. And so it was almost like chalk and cheese. But once my father got riled, he was only about 5'8" or 9, but he had a great deal of physical strength. For example, I've got an example in my book about when I saw him literally carrying a cast iron bath upstairs in Long Eaton, which is near Nottingham, on his back. Was a feat. I've carried a cast iron bath downstairs by letting it roll down the stairs, and I know how heavy they are. So he was a very strong man in his own right.
Spent time in Dunkirk as well.
Yes, Dunkirk was really quite an experience. I've done a lot of research on the unit that he was in and what its experiences were. And it was one of the last units to leave Dunkirk during the evacuation. And he was one of the last. In fact, his service papers show that he was taken off the beaches on the 4th of June 1940, which was the last day of evacuation of Dunkirk. Now, one of the few things he did tell me about his life then was that he literally swam out to a boat offshore, because large boats couldn't get into Dunkirk because of the shallow water. But he swam and he swam, and he finally gave up. He decided he just wanted to sink down and give up. And he sank into the water, he told me, and then sure enough, it was that shallow. He found that his feet hit the bottom, and he was able to push himself back up again, and he was rescued. But it was a fraught time for him.
So, when your mum was 83, your mum gave you her diaries. Did she tell you anything about them and why she was giving them to you?
That's a very good question. I really don't know the answer. She could have, in a sense, she could have just thrown them away. But clearly they meant a lot to her. They're only small diaries. They're only diaries with three days per page. But they're very closely written in pencil quite often, which is very difficult to read. But essentially, the answer to your question is they must have meant a lot to her. And I think it's because of all the wartime experiences she had as effectively a single girl, even though she was married in 1939. She was more or less a single girl through to 1945 because my dad, clearly with the diaries, I know when he came home, and he was literally with her for less than a year in the full 6 years of the war.
Did you read them straight away as soon as you got them?
Well, no, I didn't. I didn't quite appreciate what she had given me, and I just simply put them in a big box along with the other diaries in the garage. But we all get more and more interested as we get older in our life history and the history of our family, and that's what I did. I started looking at all the old photographs, which were gathering dust in the garage, and then I started looking at the diaries, and then what I realised that this was really it was much more of a historical document. Yes, it was all about her life and talking about people that I knew and nobody else would have known who read them, but it was also the fact that it was reflecting the life of a young woman in wartime. What happened was that I realised, and it affected me greatly, that I had not asked them, I'd not tied them down about their war history, about what they did in the war. And now, my dad had by then long dead. He died when he was 74. And my mother wasn't all that in that good health either. And I just felt really quite guilty that I hadn't really got to know what they did before I was born.
So it was in 1939 that your mum and dad had just got married and he went off to war. Does your mother say anything about what she thought about the wrongs and rights of war?
I have to say, I mean, in one sense, if you were to read the diaries at a certain level, you would say, well, she doesn't say anything about the war. She mentions the odd bomb dropping, and she mentions she did some fire watching actually in Sutton Coldfield when she was working for the American military. But she hardly mentions the war. So on that level, you think to yourself, well, that's a very sort of shallow existence. But on the other level, her personal level, the intimate details that she puts in a diary, she was living a very, very exciting life for a young girl from a working class family. And on that level, the war pervades everything that she did.
I gather you realise that your mum used a lot of code words. What do you actually mean by code words then, Will?
Well, don't forget these are diaries which she wrote for herself. If you read her diaries, they are for her only. And so she didn't need to put in, punctuation was missing for a start, but she didn't need to explain anything to anybody else within those diaries. So, and I'll give you some examples, and they sort of indicate what sort of life she was leading. And that was that when she went out with men, and she went out with many men during the war, she would rate them, as I suppose a young girl today might rate them from 1 to 10. Her view was that a man was either boring, or nice, or very nice, or lovely. Now, I leave you and the listener to decide what those codes meant, but they meant a lot more to her than what we know now.
So, your mum then, financially, what was your mum like in day-to-day life? I'm hearing possibly a lot of expenditure on personal items.
Very much so, yes. Now, firstly, she was living at home during this time. I mean, they got married in 1939, in December 39. My dad was already in the forces by then, and as we know, he was off to northern France with the British Expeditionary Force. So she still lived with her parents. Now, they didn't charge her, it would appear from the diaries, any regular living expense. She did have a full-time job during this time, firstly with the Royal Army Ordnance Corps in Chilwell near Beeston, and then later with the American Army Pay Unit, which I think was based in Harborne in Birmingham. and that paid a reasonable wage. I think she was also getting her husband, my dad's army pay as well. As far as disposable income was concerned, I think she did have quite a lot for a young woman at that time. The question is what she spent it on. Well, she certainly spent a lot of her income on clothing. The diaries are very, very interesting in the sense that she itemised every bit of clothing that she seemed to be every bit of clothing that she bought during the war years. And in fact, the 1940 diary actually has details for her clothing expenditure for 1937 and 1938. So from a sort of historical, social point of view, I've got a run of detail going through from 38 through 37 right the way through to 45. And you can see that as time went by, she was spending more and more on clothing. In fact, her expenditure tripled on clothing between 39 and 41, 42 time. Whereas when you look at the index for clothing expenditure as a whole in the country, in fact, it went down from 100 to 50, the index, in that same time. So she was bucking the trend, as she did all through her life, I think. She was bucking the trend quite a lot there.
Now, even though she just got married, your diaries, or you say that the diaries show that your mum was extremely sociable. What do you actually mean by that?
Well, what do? You've got a diary. Why do you keep a diary? Because you are needing to know when you're going to meet somebody and where you're going to meet them. So right the way through the diaries, when you look at them and I have to say I looked at these diaries in what they call forensic detail. I won't give you the detail about how I did that, but I used an Excel spreadsheet for those who know about Excel spreadsheets. So when it says something like in the diary JB 7, then it's quite clear that she's meeting someone named or called JB at 7 o'clock. And so then you start looking for more JBs, and you realise that in this particular instance, the JB appears quite a lot during the 1940 diary. But JB was just one person. There's somebody called T, who I think was a guy called Tom. I think I know the name of JB. I think his name was Burnett. G or George or Geo was George. And so you can start looking at a pattern that takes you right the way through, and then you realise that, well, yes, she was a very sociable woman. I have to say this. Her husband was away at war, and don't forget, she was living near a military establishment which had actually 11,000 people working in it, clerical people and also military people. So she had opportunities, and also the people who were there had opportunities. They were living away from home, and they were in a war. And you might say that some people were saying to themselves, well, next week I could be dead, so let's live now.
Has all of this changed your opinion on your mum?
Well, funnily enough, it hasn't, because I know what my mother's character was like during the time when she was much more of a married woman, a more conventional married woman with all her friends, and certainly not, shall we say, playing the field like she did in the 1940s.
Why would she write all this down? What if your dad had seen it?
Well, this is a very good question. Did he see those diaries? I really, really don't know. But I have to say that the 1950s, when there are no diaries, when I was I was born in 46, so I was 10 by 56. Those early years of my life were years when my parents were at loggerheads with one another quite often, and I think that we're looking at a residue of what happened during the war. But as time went by, she settled down. In fact, they had their 50th wedding anniversary, and they lived together until my father died. So it was a love that lasted.
I know in reading the diaries, you were made to laugh and cry. So why
Yes.
the two emotions?
And quite often I did cry because it raised so many memories. That I was able to relate what happened in later years to the character of my mother in the earlier years when she didn't have me as a child. She was at that time she was childless, although unfortunately she did actually lose a daughter during the war. She died within 10 days. How can I put this? I didn't feel as though, from a moral point of view, that somehow my mother was morally very bad. I just thought to myself, it's in her character. I can see that may well have happened in the 40s because of the way she was. She was a very vivacious and very strong-charactered woman.
The diaries are now published as a book. What were you thinking about?
What was I thinking about? Well, I wanted... There were two reasons I decided that I would go for a book. I wanted to do two things. One, to write something which my family, my future family, I've got three beautiful grandsons, will want to read in maybe 20, 30, 40 years' time, when they all get interested in their family histories and so on and so forth. But also because... I'm actually a historian by nature. I thought this was a historical document which needed to be explained. It couldn't be explained by anybody else because nobody knew my mother like I knew her. Certainly not now, because everybody else has died. And so I wanted also for future historians, even though this is only a minute, shall we say, just a minute cog, shall we call it, in the historical wheel of the war. Nevertheless, I think social historians will find this interesting as time goes by.
Well, it sounds fascinating. What's the book called and where is it available?
It's called The War Diary of a Dispatch Rider's Wife. And if you go into Amazon and put in The War Diary of a Dispatch Rider's Wife, it will come up.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you on my show tonight. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to come in tonight.
That's okay. Thanks very much, Graham. Thank you.
Stories, music, life. It's Late Night Graham Torrington. Shortly before she died, Will's mum gave him her diaries. She wrote in incredible detail about her life during the war, including some very candid descriptions about what she got up to whilst Will's dad was away. They are such a remarkable snapshot of a time that's gone by that Will has now turned them into a book, and he joins me in the studio this evening. Will, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to actually come into the studio tonight.
That's okay, Graham. Thanks. Yeah.
So why do you think your mum gave you these diaries then?
Well, I think that they meant a great deal to her. I didn't know of their existence before she gave them to me, and she was 83 when she gave them to me, so it was a long time of keeping them, as it were, under wraps. These diaries, because they're war year diaries, they stand out as being something different. I did find, once I got into them, which didn't happen straight away, I found them absolutely fascinating to read.
Well, let's go back then. Tell me about your mum and your dad.
Well, they were childhood lovers, in fact. They met at the latest when my dad was 17, because I know that I think they fell in